You know, once upon a time, I feel like AAA games always took over the conversation, and indie games were just hoping that they could catch even a fraction of its audience and that they were able to kind of stand out from this high budget gaming development environment and game releases. But now it feels like we're seeing something of an inverse where indie developers are not only really standing out, but also succeeding in ways that a lot of AAA companies would really wish for. And there's no better example of that than one of the most recent indie releases, this game right here, Slay the Spire 2, which launched on March 5th, 2026 to overwhelmingly positive reviews and sitting at a 96% score on Steam. But beyond that, what really is making headlines about this game is the incredible player numbers that were unprecedented, and even I think the developers did not predict. Slay the Spire 1 is a game that is beloved among indie fans and people who like deck builder style games, but Slay the Spire 2 has completely overtaken the numbers from Slay the Spire 1. You can see right here looking at Steam charts, the all-time peak of 430,456 players. And what's worth noting is that this is a game whose player base is actually increasing over time. So at launch, we actually saw numbers closer to 177,000 players as the all-time peak. But that number kept shooting up, and a day later, 24 hours later, that number has reached an all-time peak of over 430,000 players. And what makes this figure especially impressive is that Slay the Spire 2 actually had some AAA competition. On the same day that indie game Slay the Spire 2 launched, also came Marathon, the AAA game from Sony and PlayStation and Bungie. And Marathon, a AAA game with all this marketing budget and whatnot, could not steal the thunder away from Slay the Spire 2. In fact, it was the opposite. And it feels like once upon a time, that would have been such a rarity. But in this day and age, it feels like indie releases are really taking over and really showing that people have an appetite for games that really think outside the box and that are made as pure passion projects that are not beholden to any corporate overlords. And you can tell that the developers were not expecting it. Megacrit posted the following in response to Marathon launching, saying congratulations to the Marathon team on their launch. Don't let small indie passion projects like this pass you by just because Slay the Spire 2 is out. Now, given how successful Slay the Spire 2 ended up being, a lot of people perceive this as throwing shade at Marathon, but Megacrit posted this before they saw Slay the Spire 2 numbers do what it did. And so as Megacrit itself puts it right here when responding to someone saying this is the shade of the centuries, they said it wasn't supposed to be a shade. We were just being sarcastic. We did not know we'd blow up quite to the degree that we did. That initial tweet was meant to be sarcasm for the expectation that Marathon would blow Slay the Spire 2 out of the water because it's a AAA game that launched at the same time as this indie game did. Megacrit probably had no idea that the opposite is what would end up happening, that it'd be Slay the Spire 2 who would come out on top by a pretty significant margin. And look, I have nothing against AAA games. I think there's always a place for those bleeding edge kinds of game releases. But to be able to see that indie developers can go off on their own without being beholden to executives and still thrive in that space and see that there's so many more successes of this nature and kind that are happening across the industry is just really encouraging to see, because I think indie developers are paving the road to some of the most creative projects. They're not about chasing trends that were established, but rather creating new ones or creating something that really highlights the kinds of unique experiences you can have with gaming that is beyond what market research shows, right? Because market research at the end of the day doesn't know what hasn't happened yet, right? It doesn't know about genres that are still being kind of come up with by indie developers, or it doesn't know about these kinds of experiences that a lot of the corporate heads and executives would look at and scratch their heads and be like, who would be interested in this? But these indie games with their creativity eventually do find an audience. And all of that, I think, is a wonderful thing. And the thing about Slay the Spire 2's numbers is that it's not even just about the raw numbers, but rather the trend. You can see right here that despite the fact that this game launched around the same time as Marathon, you can see there's this constant rising trend even throughout the periods of the day where you would see the least players, late at night when everyone goes to sleep. Whereas something like Marathon from Bungie, you can see while these player numbers aren't abysmal by any means, it is just a fraction of what Slay the Spire 2 managed to accomplish. And the trend you can see right here is just not anywhere what Slay the Spire 2 managed to accomplish. It's still retaining players at decent pace, and hopefully that means that there's a live service that can continue to thrive over the long term and update the game in such a way where it feels like there's a consistent cadence of fixes and overhauls and content releases. And, this is by no means like Highguard's level of drop-off, but there was a drop-off, as you can see right here, with Slay the Spire actually saw an increase of players within that same time period, and substantially so. Another AAA game that came out recently is Resident Evil Requiem, which I actually reviewed on my channel, and I really, really enjoyed this game. And a lot of people have had nothing but positive things to say about this title. It's one of the most critically acclaimed Resident Evil games. And then beyond that, the player numbers actually, with an all-time peak concurrent player number on Steam of 344,214 players at the highest level. These are probably some of the best, if not the best numbers Resident Evil has ever seen. And this is a AAA game that has overall garnered a lot of critical acclaim, a lot of positive attention, and to see this game do well also brings me joy. But yeah, even Resident Evil 9, which is a long-running series and, has the backing of a major company and publisher like Capcom, was not able to achieve the numbers that Slay the Spire 2 did at launch, this being an indie developer whose entire community and audience base was built on just the fact that the first game in particular was so addictive and word of mouth spread so much, and the loyalty and support is so substantial that Slay the Spire 2 managed to accomplish these numbers without the level of backing that a lot of AAA games have. It's seriously impressive. And again, it's like this new era compared to, eras in the past when indie games were barely trying to stand out from the AAA pack. Now it feels like AAA needs to start to stand out from the indie games, because indie games like these are performing at a level that AAA now strives for. Another recent indie hit was none other than Hollow Knight Silksong. This game took forever to make, but people were so enamored by the original Hollow Knight. People were so thrilled by what this indie developer accomplished and all the consumer-friendly practices surrounding the game that when Silksong launched, look at these numbers. Some of the biggest all-time peaks I've ever seen on Steam, and this being an indie game makes it all the more impressive. The player numbers almost reaching 600,000 players, and peaking more specifically at 587,150 players. Another recent indie launch is Mugenics, which saw an all-time peak of 115,428 players, an addictive roguelite tactics game that comes from the developers of The Binding of Isaac. It also managed to launch with numbers that surpass AAA releases like Marathon. And when it comes to roguelites, the previous record holder was Hades 2, which also launched to a very commendable 112,947 all-time peak concurrent player number on Steam. Mugenics actually managed to surpass that by a couple thousand players, and so it just feels like the indie landscape these days is one that has the potential to be juggernauts at the level of AAA, but without all the negative elements of that arena, with AAA having overinflated budgets, ridiculously high sales requirements for them to be deemed a success, corporate oversight that may diminish aspects of the creative potential of a game, whereas a lot of indies are able to just make the thing that they want to make without anyone telling them what to do. It's just a more ideal environment, and one that proves that you don't need ridiculous ambition and budgets and, ridiculously sized teams in order to make massive hits. The indie scene is highlighting just how successful you can be in the gaming landscape without having to resort to those less sustainable methods of game development. And what's crazy about Slay the Spire 2 is that this game isn't even fully out yet. It is in early access, and it is priced at $25, which isn't, a $60, $70 premium price point, but it's still a price point that you have to pay in order to get into this game. It's not a free-to-play title, and for a premium price game that is priced at more indie level, to see the kinds of numbers that it's doing is still crazy. And so, yeah, this indie studio, just made a killing with the release of the early access of this title. And if this is how the game is doing in early access, one has to wonder how the numbers will look like when the game fully launches, because for a lot of these games, early access tends to have lower player base than the final launch, because people just want to wait until the final game releases, when all of the features and content is implemented and when all of the issues are fixed. That's when you see an even bigger influx of players. Just to give you an example, Hades 2 launched in early access at 103,567 peak concurrent player numbers, and then when it launched for real, it launched to 112,947 peak concurrent player numbers. And then the most extreme version of this scenario is Baldur's Gate 3, whose early access launched to 73,980 peak concurrent player numbers on Steam. And then at launch, we got peaks of 875,343 players, which is just an insane boost of players post early access. But those kinds of things are possible when a game is exciting enough, when word of mouth is positive enough, and Slay the Spire may be looking at a similar scenario. If Slay the Spire 2 is headed towards that direction, then it may very well break even more records than it already has. Now, some people are saying that, well, technically Marathon is a new IP, Slay the Spire is something that is a little more established, but Marathon is actually not a new IP. There's like 3 Marathon games that came prior to this extraction shooter version of it that was more of like a single-player, campaign-driven first-person experience. And also, this is a game that has Bungie's name as well as Sony and PlayStation's behind it. And also, the first Slay the Spire game, its all-time peak concurrent player numbers, while pretty good for an indie game, was nowhere near the heights of past Bungie releases. So it's not like there was this known expectation that Slay the Spire 2 would do these kinds of tremendous numbers. It just happened to be this way because people are just a lot more engaged with Slay the Spire 2. You can especially tell based on the rising trend of Slay the Spire 2. Whereas something like Marathon, you can see that it is kind of starting to drop off a little bit, though it may very well be that it will stabilize at a decent player base and that will just retain over the course of the long term. But the point remains that Slay the Spire 2 is a much bigger success than some of the recent AAA releases, and ones that came out on the same day that this game did, such as Marathon. And this is not me trying to dog on Marathon or anything. It's just me showing the numbers and showing the statistics that highlight very objective truths about what's going on in this industry. And that is that indie developers are starting to come out on top. They're starting to take over. And that model is starting to become very viable and in many ways preferred if you do it right. Now, make no mistake, being an indie developer is still a risk, and successes like Hollow Knight and Slay the Spire and Hades and whatnot, those are more rare than they're commonplace. You know what I mean? Not every indie title gets to achieve this kind of success, but it goes to show that there is an appetite for really creative, really addictive indie experiences, and that these kinds of experiences can surpass your most trend-chasing AAA games that had all of the market research and all of the marketing budget behind it. You can tell that at the end of the day, if the experience is addictive and something that really resonates with people, this kind of stuff can happen. Underdog stories can become juggernaut stories. And this is not me wishing ill on AAA games or AAA live services. I always want new games that come out, no matter what genre they are, to be just as good as expected or better than expected. And I always look forward to a game being able to show evolutions in a genre and being able to show that they're pushing the boundaries of that genre. But there's just something to indie game development and the purity of the kind of creative autonomy surrounding them. The fact that there's just so much creative drive with such good intentions in an environment that really just encourages creativity and for these developers to take the time that they need and to, again, not be overruled by all of the corporate bullshit that tends to ruin a lot of game development processes. And to see that in that environment, the games can still thrive and if not far overcome a lot of these AAA releases, I think that is just a really encouraging sign that game development is more accessible than ever. And if you have a great idea that, there is a chance that you can hit the lottery, if you will, but it's not even a lottery. It wasn't just luck per se, though that's part of it. It's also that a lot of time and effort was poured into a passion project that resonated with people because people can feel the passion, the care, and the ingenuity behind what was created by an indie developer who is able to have these ideas without being shut down by corporate overheads. This is just one of the biggest surprises of the year, and I don't think anyone expected Slay the Spire 2 to do these kinds of numbers. I think a lot of people expected it to be well-received and it be pretty successful, but this is juggernaut levels of success. So I just really congratulate Slay the Spire 2, and I hope we continue to see indie hits like this that highlight that there's just a better way to make games and some of the really irresponsible risks that AAA games can take that leads to a road of unceremonious and just really unfortunate deaths of games and studios and layoffs of developers and just a lot of unnecessary strife that didn't need to happen. And hopefully what this will do is pave the road to a lot of those AAA companies with executives who are too narrow-minded, just kind of expanding their minds a little and really seeing the kinds of successes that can happen with concepts that you would think would not have a chance to be successful on a massive level that can pave the road for really great business. But anyway, I just wanted to highlight the insanity of Slay the Spire 2 having these kinds of player numbers given the AAA competition that it had to face. I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on Slay the Spire 2's massive success and what you think made Slay the Spire 2 so successful compared to other releases. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.